Lieutenant Commander Renee Dawson was used to challenges. As a high-ranking Navy officer, she had faced combat drills, high-stakes operations, and interrogations in foreign territories. But nothing prepared her for the night she was pulled over by Sergeant Daniel Briggs on a quiet stretch of highway outside Birmingham, Alabama. It was late, just past 11 p.m., the kind of hour when most people just wanted to get home. Renee had been driving for nearly 2 hours, her fingers drumming lightly against the wheel as she hummed along to an old jazz tune. She wasn't in uniform, just a black sweater and jeans, her hair pulled back. She didn't stand out, or so she thought. Then she saw the lights in her rearview mirror, red and blue, flashing, gaining on her fast. Her stomach clenched, not out of fear, but exhaustion. She signaled, changed lanes, and eased her car onto the shoulder. She put the car in park, took a slow breath, and kept both hands where they could be seen. A white patrol car stopped just behind her. The officer took his time getting out. When he finally did, he moved like a man who expected obedience. Heavy boots scuffing against asphalt, one hand resting on his belt, the other holding a flashlight that flicked on as he approached. "License and registration," he said. No greeting, no explanation. His voice was flat, practiced, impatient. Renee met his eyes in the mirror, then reached slowly into the glove compartment, pulling out her documents. "Was I speeding, officer?" she asked, her voice steady. Briggs didn't answer right away. He took the papers from her hand, holding them just out of reach as he gave her car a once-over. "Tail lights out," he said. She frowned. "That can't be right." Briggs finally looked at her. "Are you arguing with me?" A beat of silence passed. Renee could feel the shift in the air, that quiet, unspoken moment where power met resistance, and one side expected the other to cave. She'd seen it before, in briefings, on bases overseas, in training exercises meant to prepare sailors for the world outside the Navy. She knew better than to push, but she also knew her rights. "I'm just saying," she replied, voice calm. "My tail lights were checked a few weeks ago. But if there's an issue, I can get it fixed." "Step out of the car," Briggs cut her off, like he hadn't heard a word. Renee exhaled slowly. She glanced toward the traffic ahead. No witnesses. She tapped her fingers against the steering wheel once, then reached for the door handle. "Mind telling me why?" she asked. Briggs tilted his head, smirking. "Because I said so." She let that hang in the air for a second, then unbuckled her seatbelt and pushed the door open. The night air was cooler than she expected. She stepped onto the pavement, her posture relaxed but measured. She wasn't looking for a fight, but she wouldn't be bullied either. Briggs took a step back, scanning her. She could feel him sizing her up, deciding how much he could get away with. "Turn around. Hands on the car." This time she hesitated. "For what reason?" Briggs took a step closer, his smirk disappearing. "Are you resisting?" Renee held her ground. "I'm asking a question." A flicker of something crossed his face, annoyance, amusement, maybe both. Then, without warning, he reached for his radio. "We got a non-compliant driver here," he muttered into the speaker. Then, louder, "Turn around." Her pulse picked up, but her expression stayed neutral. "Officer, I need you to understand something," she said, her voice low but firm. "I know exactly what I'm allowed to do, and I know exactly what you can't do." Briggs didn't like that. His jaw tensed. "You're under arrest," he snapped, reaching for her wrist. Renee moved before he could grab her, stepping back just enough to avoid his grip. "Under arrest for what?" Briggs pulled out his cuffs. "For obstructing an officer." She exhaled sharply through her nose. So, that was his game. Her military training kicked in. Heartbeat steady, breathing even. She knew she had two choices: comply and fight this later, or push back and risk escalation. She wasn't about to become another statistic. With slow, deliberate movements, she turned, placing her hands on the roof of her car. The metal was cool against her palms. Briggs wasted no time, yanking her arms behind her back and tightening the cuffs far too much before shoving her toward the patrol car. "You don't know what you're doing," she murmured. Briggs chuckled, shoving her into the back seat. "Lady, I know exactly what I'm doing." But he didn't. Not even close. The hard plastic seat of the patrol car dug into her back. Renee sat still, wrists burning against the cuffs, her breath measured. The door slammed shut behind her, sealing her in. Outside, Briggs strutted back to his vehicle, muttering something into his radio. She glanced at the partition separating her from the front seat. The faint reflection of her face stared back, calm, composed. But beneath that, something simmered. She had been through combat drills, high-stakes operations, and interrogations in foreign territories. But this was different. This was a man with a badge, drunk on power, convinced he was untouchable. A few minutes passed, then 5, then 10. She shifted her hands slightly, testing the cuffs. Too tight. He had done it on purpose. The driver's side door swung open and Briggs slid in, whistling. "Well, well," he muttered, pulling his seatbelt across his chest. "Let's take a little ride." She didn't respond. He threw the car into gear, pulling off the shoulder and back onto the road. The patrol car lurched forward, the overhead lights still flashing. She could see the reflection of the red and blue in the side mirrors, staining the road behind them. "You know," Briggs said after a moment, "most people just keep their mouths shut when I tell them to step out." Renee exhaled sharply through her nose. "And most officers don't arrest people for questioning a traffic stop." Briggs laughed, shaking his head. "Lady, you must really think you're somebody." She looked at him through the glass. "I don't think. I know." That made him pause, just for a second. His knuckles flexed around the wheel, a flicker of irritation breaking through his smug exterior, but he covered it up quick. "You military?" he asked, his tone suddenly shifting. She didn't answer. "Yeah, I figured," he went on. "You got that attitude, that above-the-law type." He smirked. "Bet you thought I'd back off if you threw that around, huh?" Still, she stayed silent. Briggs clicked his tongue. "Shame," he mused, shaking his head. "If you'd just kept your mouth shut, we could have avoided all this." Her jaw tightened. The audacity of it, as if his actions were somehow her fault. The station came into view up ahead, a squat gray brick building just off the main road. The parking lot was mostly empty. Late-night processing was slow, and for now, it looked like she was the only guest. Briggs pulled into a reserved spot near the entrance, killed the engine, and turned to look at her through the partition. "Gotta say," he murmured, "I do love when they make it easy." Before she could respond, he was out of the car, slamming the door behind him. A second later, her door swung open. "Let's go," he ordered. Renee twisted her wrists slightly as she stepped out. The cuffs bit into her skin. He hadn't loosened them at all. She kept her head high as he led her inside, past a bored-looking desk sergeant and into processing. The holding area smelled like old coffee and sweat. A metal bench lined the far wall, a steel door leading to the cells just beyond it. Briggs uncuffed her just long enough to push her through booking, fingerprints, mugshot, the whole routine. The officers behind the desk barely looked up, just going through the motions. She had seen this kind of indifference before. It was the kind that let bad men like Briggs thrive. When it was over, he grabbed her wrist again, leading her toward the cells. "You think you're smart, huh?" he muttered under his breath. She glanced sideways. "I don't have to think." His grip tightened. She knew that got under his skin. "Enjoy your stay," Briggs sneered, shoving her toward the cell. Renee caught herself before she stumbled. She turned, watching as the metal bars slid shut between them. Briggs smirked from the other side, tapping the bars lightly with his fingers before walking away. The lock clicked into place. She took a slow breath, then sank onto the bench. The chill of the metal pressed through her jeans, grounding her. One night. That's all it would take. Because Briggs had no idea who he had just messed with.